to support student learning. And we're really going to look closely at what does a think aloud mean versus what does modeling mean. And then identify technology to support the recording and distribution of think alouds. Whether you're doing this now to support the kids, either doing this synchronously or asynchronously, this is some really good stuff to take away. And then for thinking about next fall, which is how we started the conversation before we got started here, continuing on with some kind of blended distance learning is probably going to be what most of us are doing. So it's going to come in handy. And then for those of you guys that I know on the call have been really thinking about and practicing flipped learning type of situations, this is right up your alley as well, even when we have the kids in front of us. All right, so our ground rules to begin and end on time. So it is a 1-hour session. We will be ending at 4 o'clock. Please stay focused. We do have, we try to jam pack these because we want to make sure that we give you as many of the resources as we can. Please be respectful, both in the chat and as you are unmiking yourself at certain points during the presentation. Assume positive intent. You guys have all volunteered to be here, and so we really appreciate that and welcome each and every one of you, no matter where you are in the country. We have, I believe, Ohio, Michigan, Oregon, and Texas represented today. And then the last two specifically around the webinar, please use the chat feature for questions and I'll talk more about that in just a second. And then if you would please kindly mute your microphones when not speaking, just so that ambient noise in the background does not come through to everybody else. And hopefully my dogs will be very well behaved and you won't hear them at all. All right, so a little bit of housekeeping just to reiterate around the chat. Please do indeed share your questions and ideas in the chat. Randy will be doing a lot of the back channeling today. And so just as always, for those of you who have been to some of our other webinars, we will have some opportunities to stop and jot and add ideas to the chat, as well as if you'd like to share your ideas vocally. The back channel is very powerful, and I think we've gotten a lot of really good ideas and cross-pollination from those, so just keep it up. Also, it's a great place to ask your questions. We will try to track those and respond to them at logical pauses throughout the hour, as well as a Q&A session near the end, and in any follow-up communication if we aren't able to address it during this time. And Randy and I always stick around for a few minutes afterwards in case any of you guys want to talk or have additional questions. Just for full disclosure, the chat and this recording will be saved so that we can definitely follow up on any unanswered questions or comments. And it also allows us to compile resources and ideas that you share for so that we can send those out to you guys. Autumn, thank you so much for putting in those links already that you had mentioned before we got started. So we'll be sure to get that out to everybody if you don't have a chance to look at it in the chat bar. All right, so here's our warm up for the day. So take a few moments to think about this and then type in some of your thinking in the chat bar or unmute yourself in a couple of seconds just have some think time. When do you find it helpful to model for students? What are some of those times where you're like, yes, I definitely need this. I need to model this for my students. And when you're ready, go ahead and type in some of your thinking in the chat bar, or as I said, go ahead and unmute yourself and share orally. All right, and Randy, what are we seeing?
We're seeing everything. I think is the common thread. New concepts. They're also seeing modeling being lifted, especially helpful is during reteach and review. If we didn't happen to get that concept the first time around, but a lot of folks are echoing the all the time with the new concepts or during guided instruction. We're seeing that pattern happen all throughout, and that's and our math teachers, or those who are elementary folks who also dabble in math, are also speaking to that as well. That it's such a crucial practice for their discipline, because to show students how to navigate some of the problem sets that they bring forward. But of course, as all of you well know in the field, it's available in all of your disciplines. So thank you for sharing those.
Okay, great, absolutely, yeah. Modeling can come in handy a ton of times, almost every day. It seems like, because our kids come to us with so many different varying backgrounds of what they already know, what they don't know, and how quickly they catch on to things and what their modality is. The things that we wanted to bring forward in this session is the idea of a distinction between modeling and think aloud. And if we think of it as a triangle or an iceberg, modeling is kind of the overall at the top. That's any time where we're really showing kids how to do something. And modeling could also be in terms of like the directions for doing something. A think aloud is a bit more specific type of where we really are trying to make our thinking and our thought processes, the questions that we ask as we read, as we solve, whatever we're doing, to make that as visible as possible so that we can really get the kids to do the same type of thinking and the same type of questioning on their own. So it's really making that internal dialogue that we have with ourselves external, so that we can really show the kids. So some of the essential practices for a think aloud that we'll talk about today, there's 5 of them. The first one is to determine the target skill in text. That's where we always start, no matter what the strategy is what is it that I really need to show my kids and to think aloud around. Then it's identifying any relevant sub-skills. It's not just those big pieces like the fractions or the slope-intercept form that Liz brought forward, but it's also those sub-skills, the requisites, those things where it's like if the kids don't know and don't know how to do those, or don't know how to find words in context as well, those are some of those things that we want to really bring forward. The third thing is to identify those touchstone or key talking points. And we're really going to stress to you guys to really think first and write out a script when you do a think aloud. The good news is that now, right now, we're basically taping ourselves doing this in some way, shape, or form, and we'll look at several examples. In a face-to-face classroom, sometimes we try to do think alouds right there in person, and that can be a little bit more difficult. So this is really a good opportunity, trying to find a silver lining, for us to practice these think alouds and really get good at them if it's something that we haven't been doing as much in the past. Fourth, then, is to determine how students will engage. It's one thing to do the think aloud, but it's not for us, it's for the kids. So what is it that they're supposed to do? What are they supposed to do while we're doing that think aloud, whether it's in person during a synchronous session or during watching an asynchronous video? And then finally, determining how students will be held accountable. I saw several people in the chat talk about modeling at the beginning of an assignment or a project. And so then it's a question of, so what do with that information that we have just done a think aloud around? Okay. So the first one, determine the target skill in text. The target skill is, oftentimes we choose one that's commonly repeated because we want this think aloud to be something that the kids not only use today, but they use tomorrow, next week, and the week after, and the month after. Thinking about one where students struggle with either the thought processes or the decision trees that they should be doing already in their mind. Good readers know what they just know how to read. Our struggling readers, they don't know what that inner dialogue should be. The same thing goes with any other type of thought process in our other classes. If they're good mathematicians, they know how to think like a mathematician. If they're good at figuring out the rules of a sport, it's because they have some sort of innate ability, or they have a lot of experience. So it's really trying for those kids that are struggling to help them gain that inner thought process and inner decision tree. We also need to make sure that we have a target text or media. Typically, we want to have something where it's, oftentimes we think aloud a text. That really is probably most likely that we do. But we also want to make sure that we can use other media as well. And we'll take a couple of looks at examples of those. But we want to make sure that whatever that text or media is, it's one that exemplifies those common tropes or common struggles or techniques or devices that we really want the kids to use. So in other words, it may be looking at how to solve a word problem. It might not be the math skill itself, but it's the problem solving aspect. We may, for our text, we may have read aloud and think aloud the first paragraph of a longer text, and then the kids are off and running from there. From there then, as we dig even deeper, then it's thinking about those relevant sub-skills. What are the building blocks for the main skill? Those foundations that's necessary for completing this or similar tasks. And what skills are taught in conjunction? Thinking about those interwoven topics whose mastery is dependent on each other. For instance, I watched a Think Aloud video of a teacher just yesterday who was doing some fitness Think Aloud videos for his kids. And it wasn't just the exercise itself, but it was the whole technique and routine about keeping the back out, keeping the legs at a particular degree and angle. It was all of those things. And he also did a really great think aloud of where in the world do you find weights at your house from common, ordinary objects. So he kind of went through his house and did a think aloud of thinking about, is this going to be a good idea or not? So it was a really great thing to see. So let's look at a couple of examples and bear with us. We think that the sound should come through well enough. If not, you will definitely make sure that you get the PowerPoint so you can hear the video. These are really just very, very short snippets of a much longer think aloud. So in this instance, this is an example of a teacher, that's me, using a camera. So whether that's a dock camera that you might have at your house, or, you know, we might be investing more and more into those cheaper dock cameras to have at home, or whether it's your cell phone that you put on a tripod and zoom down to see. So let's take a look and then we'll talk on the other side here. Think through how I would solve this problem. And the first thing I do is remind myself of the acronym that we've used in class. And then I really want to look and see those verbs. Remember how we've talked about that. So as I look, I'm like, I know that I can get lost in my drawings. So I'm going to decide to highlight. Okay, I told you it was a short snippet. One of the things to bring forward about this example is the idea of listening in on some of those key phrases that we can use to really help the kids. When I do this, I think. When I'm solving this, here's what I do. So that they're really, really listening in and understanding the thought process that goes through in solving a word problem. Okay. Another example is using an app called Screencastify, which is free to us. And this is really helpful if we're wanting to capture something on the web or on our screen. In this case, it's for a physical science class where the kids are getting ready to do a simulation lab at home. So there's no sound to this, but I just want to show just a quick brief piece of what the teacher did in this case. So they manipulated the pieces as they talked, and they even tried to draw tried to draw the actual, starting to draw the actual data chart that the kids would use. So this is a combination of modeling the logistics of how to run this lab, but we can also very good think aloud in terms of, so what does my chart look like? How do I make decisions of what I'm going to do in this simulation? Okay. And Screencastify is a really good one for the simple fact that we can add it to our browser. And I think that Randy just put that in the chat as well. And that way it's really quick and easy to hit the button to record. And it even lets you cut and make a few easy edits to your video once it's done. And then it's a very quick share to the classroom or publish to a safe YouTube channel type of situation. Okay. So whether you're doing something where you're reading or solving, walking through the thought processes, I would like us to do a stop and jot on how can focusing a think aloud on specific and sub skills really support our students. What's our thinking around that? Okay, and whenever you are ready, go ahead and add to the chat or unmute yourself if you would rather respond orally. All right, and Randy, what are we seeing in the chat?
We're seeing in not as many words that it gives access to some of the expert thinking, right? Us being the experts in the field. And so showing kids how, real life grown-ups navigate these problems is certainly very helpful. Other people are mentioning that it gives students access to multiple modalities, right? So if we're performing a think aloud, as in the video clips you mentioned here, there's certainly that visual component of what do I do and how do I structure this? And there's also the audio component of you talking through, you being the instructor, talking through how to solve that individual problem. Again, we're echoing those thoughts of modeling what happens in our own minds so that we can make that visible for kids and gives them another point of view for them to explore the thinking from. So all of them or many of our submissions speak to the fact that we're just making that thinking visible and allowing kids to see what those who are already proficient at the task do.
Okay, thank you. Yes, and the other thing that oftentimes we hear and talk with teachers about with the Think Aloud is it really is a good, tool to help support students no matter where they are in that learning, because they either can identify, I do that too, and it's a reinforcement. So I think I saw a little bit of that in the chat. But for our kids that really are struggling, then it's okay, that's what I need to do so that I can same type of situation. Okay, great. All right, so moving forward then, our third piece is to identify those touchstone or key talking points. And this really is the make or break for us as the adults. We really need to take some time to outline those key understandings so that we really can think about as we tape ourselves, do this in a synchronous setting or even in the face-to-face classroom, it can really help mitigate that last class of the day is the best class phenomenon that I know we all, I'm sure, have had, where it was like, dang, why didn't I think to say that during first period or during the beginning of that block? So this can really help us make sure that we've got those exact pieces that we want. And it outlines those sub-skills as well. So since if we really want to focus on the questions that we ask ourselves as we read or as we solve some type of problem, we want to write those down so that we've got almost like a script ready to go. And we can also really focus in on, so what's the next step? What's the next thing that I do to really help show that scaffolding for the kids, that if they're seeing something that's daunting, whether it's a text or whether it's another type of activity, they can see how they can also chunk it and break it down just like we can do as we're modeling and thinking aloud. So here's an example that was done on a PowerPoint. And the PowerPoint allows us to put audio to the different slides. We can either kind of like not dictate, but narrate the whole slideshow, or we can add audio to each of the individual. So in this case, this is about a book. I had trouble in getting to Aloud by Dr. Seuss, and it's a small snippet of what a possible Think Aloud might look like in order to really try to help the students with words in context.
Well, I know what happy means, I know what young means, but carefree, I'm not so sure about. Now, the other two words kind of have a positive to it, so maybe carefree is also positive. And when I read and I run across a word I don't know, the first thing I do is see if there's a word inside it that I might know.
Okay. So once again, thinking about those key words to help support students. When I do this, here's what I'm thinking. When I run across a word I don't know, here's the first thing that I do. Here's the second thing.
Anissa, we had some trouble hearing what you were thinking aloud about. Can you share us a short summary of what Think Aloud sounded like?
I sure can. So in this case, the teacher is reading the very first line of the story. I was real happy and carefree and young. And one of the key skills that the teacher wants to focus on is words in context. So she may talk about the fact that she knows what the word happy means. She knows what the word young means. Again, thinking about what words might her students know as well. But when she sees carefree, it may be that she realizes, you know what, some of my kids might not know what carefree means. So then she thinks aloud, how would she tackle when she sees words that she may not know, and how does she use context clues? So in this case, it was using phrases like, when I see a word I don't know, here's the first thing I do. I try to look, do I know a word within the word? And so she went on to talk about how what free makes her think of, be connected to happy and young. From there, the rest of the Think Aloud goes through the whole rest of the first page, which is essentially a paragraph long, and really focuses in on a couple of key skills. So for instance, her script that she writes ahead of time may look like, okay, carefree, positive, free makes me think that I don't have a lot of problems or worries. So she really about how can I explain this to kids? How can I show them what's going on? And she did that for several of the other pieces within that Think Aloud, really focusing in on words words in context, as well as punctuation, such as ellipses. But really, really important to have that script, or else we forget half the things we want to say. And then we're like, oh crap, let me hit pause. Let me try to go back. So the more we can with that script, the easier it becomes on us. This is not a video, it's just a screenshot, but we wanted to show this as another example of how you might create a Think Aloud. The last one was a PowerPoint. This one is Google Slide, because I know a lot of us are using Google Classroom. And for those of you who might have been in another one of our sessions where we talked about Pear Deck, Pear Deck is another app that is, you add it on into your Google Suite. And so when you open up Google Slides, you can start to type on there, and then you can hit the add audio, and Pear Deck allows you to add the audio in Google Slides. So it works very similarly, where you could put some text in here, or something else, and a picture that you might want to think through and show kids how you might analyze a work of art, or how you might the picture to think about the historical context of it. But it's just another way. So whatever one you feel more comfortable with, or that you want to try out. So that's the front side. That's getting it ready and creating that Think Aloud for our kids. The other thing though, before we post it to our Google Classroom or before we do it in our synchronous session, really think about, so what will students do while you are doing the thinking aloud? Are they expected to replicate the steps? For instance, the teacher that I talked about that was doing the fitness program, the kids were expected to stop the video and try the exercise, for instance, or find the pieces that they could use as weights. Do they take, so are we using the Think Aloud as a twist on a lecture? So instead of giving content information, this is really thinking aloud the process around how to do a certain skill. Do they complete a graphic organizer? Do they follow along? And then that gets us to the next piece. Do they follow along while we do it and then are expected to do something with that to practice that skill so that we know whether they've understood the skill? So whether that's student to student interactions, such as a discussion board or discussion during one of our Google Meets or WebEx sessions, or it could be writing, where we have them write something in their journal, we have them do a Google form, whatever other type of situations that we might have the kids do a writing about it. We may have them create a video. If it's something where we want to see if they can replicate that skill and thought process, it could be that we ask them to do their own Think Aloud of solving a problem. Or of reading out loud and basically annotating how do they go about figuring out what those words are in context, just to kind of connect to one of our examples. In some way, shape, or form, we want the kids to have some kind of independent practice so that they're not just passive learners and watching us, but then they become those active learners and doing the same thing that we were doing in our Think Aloud. And it could be that we also use those check-in calls or office hours or during Google Meet to just check in with kids to see how they're doing and possibly having them show us in some way, shape, or form where they're at in the learning. Randy?
Vanessa, if I can interject for a moment, I had a private chat ask about how we get students to perform their own Think Alouds. What are some tips we might give to students for designing their own Think Alouds as we're thinking about the structure here?
Okay, great question. And it is absolutely a great activity to have the kids do. Step one is to model for them and to do our own Think Alouds. Then what we've seen a lot of teachers do, similar to helping kids with discussions or with responding in any way, shape, or form, is what are some of those key phrases that we might want kids to use? So for example, just like we talked about how in our Think Alouds, we want to make sure we use terms like, when I run across this problem, here's how I tackle it, here's how I do it, or when I'm reading, these are the questions that I think about. So we want the kids to do that same type of language, and those will help guide them as they're thinking about doing that Think Aloud. Obviously, Think Alouds are typically pretty short, just because they should be that short snippet that's very focused on a particular skill. Mm-hmm. So that definitely applies double for the kids, that it should be a short Think Aloud of a minute or less, especially the first time, and really getting there. Randy, anything else to add to that of what you've had conversations about?
One thing I think that's helpful to keep in mind if we're asking students to do that is to ask them very much to draft their own script, right? And to make that part of the formative assessment as well. First, because it models the thinking that we would want ourselves to do as professional thinkers aloud, but also because it gives us that tangible artifact to see where their thinking went, and we might be able to see the video, and we know there's all kinds of performance anxiety that comes along with recording yourselves, and we feel that too. But seeing what thinking they have on paper or in that doc or whatever it might be can be another way to really see where their thinking and understanding is with that skill. So it's another way for us to formally assess their knowledge of that particular process that we're focusing on.
Okay, great. All right, so since we're already kind of stopping and thinking, let's do a formal stop and jot and add some things to our chat. What are some interaction and accountability strategies that you feel might work best for you and your students? So so when you do think alouds, what are some of the interactions that you want kids to do while you're doing the think aloud? And what are some of those accountability strategies that you feel might work best for you and your students following the think? Okay, and Randy, what are some of the things that we're seeing in the chat while people continue to add?
One of the first things that came out was the use of graphic organizers, and that makes a lot of sense, right? If we want them to compartmentalize and see a step-by-step process for doing something, a graphic organizer helps to convey that and helps to give them that visual reminder of how these steps flow in order. Other people are talking about direct dialogues with the teacher. So asking the students to replicate what was involved and to, I presume, experiment and to say, here's what I did. Now, can you apply that, while I'm looking over your shoulder and do some things there? Lots of talk about student observation as well. One thing that makes me think of as I see some observation of students is to think about having your own anecdotal notes that you might take alongside, which is a little bit tougher to do in the remote setting, granted. But certainly in face-to-face instruction, whatever limited scope that happens next year, being able to observe the thinking, take some of those anecdotal notes might be helpful as well. Also seeing thinking maps as another version of kind of a graphic organizer that helps us show how kids are thinking about something. As well as written responses to comments. So we can, Colleen, can you type a little bit more or share a little more about what you were thinking around that? And feel free to unmute yourself, please, Colleen.
So are you asking about the Google Classroom comments?
Yes.
So I work with third graders, and it's easiest for the kids when we have presentations or whatever we do. The students and the comment box under those presentations, the students will share their thinking and their ideas in the comment box under the presentations.
So can you give us an example of some of the thinking they might share?
Okay, so an example with a story that the students read for language arts. The teacher had some questions, and the teacher, had talked about, one of our teachers had talked about what happens in the event, and how and what they've discovered through this reading. And then one of the students said, whether they agreed or disagreed with what was being said and how they felt about it, that type of a comment, that kind of reaction to it.
Okay, so another way for them to track their thinking and make their thinking visible as a sort of reaction. So they're seeing all this thinking flowing together. Okay,
yes.
Thank you for elaborating on that. And again, things like thinking maps and things have been lifted too in SS. So lots of great ideas and lots of different ways we might have students interact with our thinking here.
All right, good. And I know that all of us on the phone have at least some of our kids that are struggling with technology, with the access. And so for those that can have a video sent to them via email or on their phone in some way, shape, or form, we can still do that type of visual think aloud. The other thing that we didn't talk about so much today is every once in a while we have seen teachers try to do a think aloud on paper. So in other words, it's almost like using comment bubbles and annotations on a text that show, as I'm reading this, here's what I'm thinking, here's how I'm annotating. So it may be another way that we can do a think aloud, and really, again, the key is to show that dialogue, that thinking that we do, to make that visible for the student.
And as you lift that idea, thinking about being in some of our shoes at the moment, I would want to think about ways to work smarter, not harder, right? So if I was going to create that resource where I had to think aloud on paper and I had speech bubbles showing how I was annotating things, that might also be what I use on my doc camera as well to really highlight students as I go through that thought process, right? So I'm creating one resource, but using it in two different ways to support kids with varying access to technology.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I know that the vast majority of us do not have a doc cam at home, but again, if you have a way to, on a tripod to put your camera, your cell phone camera so that it's pointed downward, that works pretty darn good as a doc cam at home. The other thing is that, you know, that's assuming that we're writing something out or that we want to show the, a paper version of the text or whatever we're working with. If we're thinking about working smarter, not harder, as Randy said, one thing that I was talking with a teacher about, she was going to use an article through ReadWorks, which is an online source for all sorts of different nonfiction text. And so she was going to think aloud through the first paragraph. But using Screencastify, I believe that also allowed her to at least underline, if not like highlight. So she could make some annotations on the screen. And so for her pocket kids, as they are called, she was able to then do the same thing essentially by printing out the ReadWorks article and making the same type of annotations and comments in the margin to send home to the kids. So great thinking, Randy, in terms of smarter, not harder. Okay, so a couple of the implementation tips that we really want to think about and keep in mind as we move forward for the rest of this year. When we're thinking about in distance, for our synchronous sessions, for those of us who do have synchronous sessions for our kids, mind the mute buttons. When we're doing the think aloud, we really want to make sure that they are listening to us, but also building in those stopping points. That's really critical. If a student is like, wait, what did you just say? What are you, what is it? Then you've got those stopping points in there. For our synchronous then is really capturing that thinking, whether we're using PowerPoint, Screencastify, Screencast-O-Matic, Pear Deck, Camera. I'm sure there's other ones and feel free to add them into the chat. We didn't want to overwhelm everybody, but did want to bring in a couple of different ideas that we use. Or you can even record those synchronous conversations. So if you're meeting with a group of like 5 to 6 kids and decide to do a think aloud with them, record that Google Meet or record that WebEx or Zoom meeting, and then you would be able to post that or send that to the other kids as well. In general, some common considerations as we're planning this, stick to the script. That sounds silly, but the more that we can almost script out how we're going to say our think aloud, the better they typically turn out. And we don't feel like we're still forgetting things. Communicate expectations. As we've talked about, when you're doing the think aloud, what are the expectations of the kids? What should they be doing during that time? What should they be doing afterwards? And then choose the right formative assessment for the job. Are you going to have them video? Are you going to have them write a reflective response? Are you going to have them read something and do the same type of annotation? Are you going to have them work out a word problem using the same the same steps and you know, acronym? So whatever that is, just making sure that that matches. Okay. All right, and then for our closure, whoops. First of all, are there any questions or other thoughts or comments that people have as they've been trying Think Alouds or thinking about the next Think Aloud they may do? All right, well, that was my practicing think time, wait time. So Randy and I will stick around for a few more moments if you need to. And as always, for our closure, right after this, as soon as we get off, we will please check your emails, the one that you used in order to register for this session. There'll be a feedback survey. We really, really appreciate the feedback. And it also is how we can help track attendance for those certificates that we'll be offering that first week of June. Also on the will ask you to answer the exit ticket. It's also written in the email, but the exit ticket this week is for which upcoming skill or skills would your students benefit from your creating a Think Aloud, and what might that look like? So just getting us to really start thinking ahead of what that might look like in the upcoming week of instruction. All right, and as always, it is awesome to see you guys. For those of you who are back for another session, and for those of you who it's your first time, it is so good to see you all. And as we said, if you have any questions or want to chat, feel free to stick around. If not, have a fantastic Friday afternoon and great weekend. And thank you all so much. Randy, any other thoughts?
No, I was just following up with some questions that Chris brought up, or Chris Gill brought up in chat, and trying to follow up with those. But yeah, for the questions about resources and such, we will, of course, will compile them and send them out to you. So look forward to that email either later this evening or first thing Monday morning. Depends on how long the video takes to process here in the background, but we'll get that to you very shortly.